Some moments arrive quietly. They do not announce themselves. They do not feel important while they are happening. A walk, a familiar path, a stretch of ground crossed by many feet before and since. In 1994, one such moment unfolded near the wooded footpaths that surround Heathrow Airport. Above, aircraft rose and descended in steady rhythm. Engines marked the hours. The sky was never still. Below, life moved at walking pace. Footpaths curved alongside trees and open ground, places used by commuters, by locals, by people passing through without leaving a trace. It was an area shaped by movement, yet strangely private, a place where someone could be near one of the busiest airports in the world and still feel alone. That day, a young woman was walking near the woods. Nothing about the moment suggested it would matter beyond itself. No warning, no signal, no reason to believe the walk would become anything other than another memory in an ordinary life. And yet, it did not end the way it should have. That walk never truly resolved. What followed was not silence, it was noise. Interviews began almost immediately. Officers spoke to residents, workers, drivers, travelers. People were asked where they had been, what they had seen, who they remembered. Thousands of conversations took place. Every possible angle was considered. The area was searched, paths were retraced, timelines were built and rebuilt. The media arrived quickly. Headlines filled newspapers. Television crews stood near the trees. The case entered public conversation. For months, then years, the story remained present. People recognized the name. They recognized the place. They recognized the sense that this should not remain unanswered. And yet, as the 1990s moved toward their end, something changed, not dramatically, quietly. The questions remained, but the answers did not arrive. Leads slowed. Witness memories softened. Technology reached its limits. The millennium came and went. The case did not. It stayed behind, unresolved, held together by paper files, recorded statements, and evidence preserved with care, but without certainty. This is where many stories begin to fade, but this one did not disappear. It waited. The setting itself became part of the mystery. Heathrow Airport is a place of constant motion. Millions pass through it each year. Workers come and go. Vehicles arrive and depart at all hours. It is designed for movement, not memory. And yet, beside it, the footpaths and wooded areas remain largely unchanged. Rain still darkens the ground. Leaves still gather along the edges of the trail. Planes still pass overhead, loud enough to remind anyone walking there that the world is always moving forward. It is a place where anonymity is easy. In 1994, investigators believed attention would bring resolution. With enough interviews, enough public focus, someone would come forward. Something would connect. That belief was reasonable for the time, but attention alone could not solve what science could not yet explain. The case became a question carried forward by process rather than progress. Why did it stop here? How did so much effort still fall short? How does a person vanish into familiarity? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, how does someone remain unseen for 30 years? Because while the investigation paused, life did not. The roads stayed busy, the airport expanded, cameras multiplied, technology advanced, people built routines. Some drove the same routes day after day. Some passed the same buildings, the same streets, the same places of authority, including the police station. For 3 decades, someone connected to this story lived an ordinary public life, not hidden away, not removed from the area, present, driving past the place where the questions had once gathered. This is not a story about absence. It is a story about proximity, about how closeness can disguise connection, about how routine can dull suspicion, about how familiarity can become a kind of camouflage. The early years of the case were defined by effort. The years that followed were defined by waiting. Files were stored. Evidence was preserved. The story became something that existed mostly in archives and memory. Yet even in storage, the case was not finished, because science does not move in straight lines. It advances quietly, steadily, often unnoticed, until it changes everything. The people working this case in the 1990s could not imagine what would be possible decades later. They could only preserve what they had and trust that someday it might matter. And it did. But before science spoke, there was time. Time enough for habits to form. Time enough for routines to harden. Time enough for a face to become part of the background. Time enough for a man to live and work in the same area for 30 years. Time enough for a story to wait. This case asks questions that go beyond one moment in 1994. How does visibility fail when systems rely on it? How does attention fade without resolution? What happens when answers arrive long after the questions were asked? And what does justice look like when it does not arrive quickly, loudly, or dramatically, but slowly, methodically, and without spectacle? As rain continues to darken the paths near Heathrow, and planes continue to rise and fall overhead, this story reminds us of something uncomfortable: that a place can remember when people do not, that evidence can wait when memories cannot, and that sometimes the truth is not hidden far away. Sometimes it passes by every day. This is the story of a walk that never truly ended, and of how 30 years later, science finally gave it a destination. To understand why this case resisted resolution for so long, you have to understand the place where it unfolded. Heathrow in the 1990s was not just an airport, it was an ecosystem. From the air, it looked orderly. Runways laid out with precision, terminals expanding outward, aircraft arriving and departing in steady intervals. But on the ground, it was something else entirely, a living network of movement that never truly paused. Day and night, people came and went: pilots, cabin crew, ground staff, security personnel, cleaners, caterers, contractors, drivers, thousands of them every single day. Some stayed for hours, some for shifts, some for years. Others passed through once and never returned. The faces changed constantly, and yet the routine stayed the same. Delivery routes crisscrossed the surrounding roads like veins. Vans moved between warehouses, catering depots, maintenance facilities, hotels, and local businesses. Timetables ruled everything. Efficiency mattered. Familiarity was assumed. In that environment, repetition became invisible. A white van on a Tuesday looked no different from a white van on a Friday. A driver stopping near a footpath did not draw attention. It fit the rhythm of the place. This was the world surrounding the wooded areas near the airport. Just beyond the perimeter fences and service roads, the atmosphere changed. The sound softened. Engines faded into a distant roar. The ground dipped and rose unevenly. Trees gathered closer together. Footpaths cut through the landscape, worn down by years of use. These were not tourist trails. They were practical routes, shortcuts, places locals used to move between neighborhoods, bus stops, and workplaces. It was here, in this narrow margin between global transit and local routine, that the case took shape. This in-between space defined everything that followed. The woods were not remote, yet they were not crowded. The paths were used, yet rarely watched. The area was known, yet strangely anonymous. For investigators, this created immediate complications. In most cases, environments offer clarity. Either they are controlled and contained, or they are isolated and defined. This place was neither. Anyone could enter the area without raising suspicion. Anyone could leave just as easily. There were no gates, no checkpoints, no natural boundaries that mattered. And because Heathrow never sleeps, time itself blurred. A person walking at mid-morning looked no different from someone passing through at dusk. Shifts overlapped, routes overlapped, faces overlapped. In 1994, surveillance existed, but it was limited. CCTV cameras were present in some locations, but not everywhere. Their coverage was uneven. Their quality was low by modern standards. Grainy images, fixed angles, short retention periods. Footpaths and wooded areas were rarely monitored. Even where cameras existed, they were not designed for identification. They captured motion, not detail, shadows instead of features, shapes instead of certainty. This meant investigators relied heavily on people. Interviews became the backbone of the case. They spoke to residents living nearby, workers employed at the airport, drivers who passed through the area, business owners along surrounding roads. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Each one mattered. Each one was documented. Each one added a piece to the growing mosaic. But a mosaic can become overwhelming. With so many people passing through the area daily, distinguishing relevance from coincidence became difficult. Someone seen near the woods might have been there for entirely ordinary reasons. A van parked briefly could have been making a delivery. A person walking alone might have been heading to work. In Heathrow's shadow, normal behavior overlapped endlessly with potential relevance. The investigation expanded outward, but the environment resisted narrowing. Transient populations made consistency rare. A witness seen one week might be gone the next. Temporary workers rotated in and out. Contractors changed assignments. Seasonal staff came and went. Records existed, but they were fragmented. Employment lists changed. Delivery companies updated routes. Addresses shifted. What looked solid one month could dissolve the next. This is one of the hidden challenges of cases tied to transport hubs. Movement itself becomes noise. Every road carries traffic. Every face blends into another. Every routine looks like every other routine. In quieter settings, absence stands out. In this place, presence was everywhere. Investigators were not facing a lack of information. They were facing too much of it. And without modern tools to filter, compare, and connect, the volume itself became an obstacle. At the same time, the public watched closely. Media coverage was extensive. Reporters stood near the woods, describing the area to viewers who had never seen it before. The contrast was often emphasized. Such a quiet place, so close to such a busy airport. People recognized the setting. They drove past it. They walked nearby. They felt the discomfort of familiarity. Tips poured in. Some were useful. Some were well-intentioned. Some were based on memory rather than fact. Each one had to be assessed, logged, compared. The investigation moved forward, but not in a straight line. Paths were retraced repeatedly. Timelines were adjusted. Theories were considered, then set aside. Nothing fully aligned. Heathrow's constant movement meant that even strong leads often ended without confirmation. A person seen one day could be impossible to locate the next. A vehicle seen once could belong to dozens of companies. The airport's expansion over the years added another layer of complexity. Roads were rerouted, buildings were replaced, landmarks changed. What had existed clearly in 1994 became harder to visualize even a few years later. Investigators relied on maps and records that no longer matched the physical reality of the area. Meanwhile, life continued. Drivers kept driving, workers kept working, planes kept flying overhead, and within that continuity, familiarity deepened. People who had been present in the mid-1990s became long-term fixtures. Delivery drivers learned every turn and shortcut. They knew when traffic would slow. They knew which roads to avoid. They passed the same points of reference day after day, including the police station. This detail would matter later, but at the time it was invisible. Routine is powerful that way. It makes repetition unremarkable. In the years after the initial investigation, the case gradually shifted from urgency to maintenance. Files were reviewed periodically. Evidence was preserved carefully, but active pursuit became difficult to justify without new information. This was not neglect, it was limitation. The tools of the time had reached their edge. What remained was an environment that held its secrets well. Fog often settled over the wooded areas, especially in the early mornings. From a distance, the trees seemed to absorb sound. Footsteps disappeared quickly. Sightlines were short. Even today, aerial views show how close everything is. Runways, roads, paths, neighborhoods. But being close does not mean being visible. This was the paradox at the heart of the case, one of the busiest places in the world, and a mystery that could not be seen. The investigation did not fail because people didn't care. It struggled because the setting refused to simplify. Endless vehicles created endless possibilities. Endless faces created endless uncertainty. And without a way to separate one from the other, the case remained suspended, waiting. Not forgotten, but paused. Because sometimes a place doesn't give up its answers easily. Sometimes it takes decades before the noise quiets enough for a single truth to stand out. And when that happens, it's not because the place changed, it's because the tools did. Heathrow's shadow remained the same, but what could be seen within it was about to change. By the time the reality of the situation settled in, the response was already underway. Uniformed officers were among the first to arrive, followed quickly by specialists trained to manage major investigations. The area near the footpaths and woods was secured with care, not because it looked dramatic, but because it mattered. Every detail mattered. The ground, the surroundings, the ordinary objects that might otherwise be overlooked. This was not a case that unfolded slowly. It moved fast. Within hours, the disappearance had shifted from concern to certainty. By the end of the first day, it was clear that this was no longer a search for someone who might simply return home. The language used by authorities remained measured, but the urgency was unmistakable. Teams worked in rotation. Maps were drawn and redrawn. Timelines were established, then adjusted. The woods were searched repeatedly. Paths were walked again and again. Officers spoke to anyone who might have been nearby, even briefly. Joggers, dog walkers, airport staff finishing shifts, drivers making deliveries. In the early days, the focus was simple. Find answers quickly, while memories were fresh and movements still traceable. What followed was one of the most extensive investigative efforts the region had seen in years. Thousands of interviews were conducted, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Each interview followed a structure. Names were recorded, times were noted, locations were marked. Even when someone believed their information was insignificant, it was still logged. Because in investigations like this, small details sometimes carry unexpected weight. The scale of the operation reflected the seriousness of the case. Local police were joined by regional units. Resources were reassigned. Overtime became routine. Officers worked long hours, driven by the belief that momentum mattered. The public became part of the process almost immediately. News coverage spread rapidly, first through local broadcasts, then nationally. Newspapers printed maps of the area. Television segments replayed footage of the footpaths and woods, accompanied by calm but firm appeals for information. The message was consistent. If you were there, if you saw something, if you remember anything at all, come forward. and people did. Phones rang constantly, letters arrived, anonymous tips were submitted. Some accounts were clear and specific, others were vague, shaped by memory and emotion rather than certainty. The volume was overwhelming. Investigators faced a paradox. The more attention the case received, the harder it became to isolate what truly mattered. Each new piece of information demanded time, verification, cross-checking. Witnesses sometimes contradicted one another. One person recalled seeing a vehicle stopped briefly. Another remembered someone walking alone. A third was certain about a time that conflicted with established records. None of this meant people were being dishonest. Memory is influenced by repetition, by media coverage, by conversations. As days turned into weeks, recollections began to shift subtly. Investigators understood this, they accounted for it, but it added complexity. Public vigilance intensified. People adjusted their routines. Footpaths that once felt ordinary were avoided. Parents warned their children to stay close. Neighbors looked out for one another with renewed attention. The case became a topic of conversation in workplaces, homes, and public spaces. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it expresses itself through caution, through awareness, through silence. Despite the intensity of the response, progress remained elusive. This was not for lack of effort. The problem was evidence. In 1994, forensic science was capable but limited. DNA testing existed, but it was not what it is today. Samples had to be of sufficient quality and quantity. Databases were small. Matches were rare unless a suspect was already known to authorities. Evidence collected from the scene was preserved carefully, but there was no immediate comparison point. Nothing in the system produced a definitive result. Without a usable forensic match, investigators relied heavily on people, and people, as sources of information, are complex. Witness overload became a challenge. When hundreds of accounts point in different directions, patterns are hard to establish. Investigators created charts, timelines stretched across walls, names and places were connected with lines and notes, but the connections refused to settle into clarity. Technology added another layer of limitation. CCTV footage, where available, lacked detail. Faces blurred into motion. Vehicles appeared as shapes rather than identifiers. Timestamps were sometimes imprecise. Storage was finite, meaning not all footage could be preserved indefinitely. Digital tools for analysis were minimal. Much of the work was manual. Physical files, paper records, human memory. And yet, the case did not fade. Throughout the 1990s, it remained present. Anniversaries brought renewed coverage, appeals were repeated, fresh reviews were conducted. Each time, hope resurfaced that a missed detail might finally stand out. But attention alone was not enough. This became the quiet lesson of the decade. A case can dominate headlines, it can occupy public consciousness, it can mobilize vast resources and still resist resolution. Investigators revisited early assumptions. Was the timing correct? Were the routes mapped accurately? Had certain accounts been given too much weight or not enough? Each review was thorough. Each concluded with the same reality. Without new evidence or new tools, progress would remain limited. This was not failure in the dramatic sense. It was restraint. Law enforcement doesn't move forward on hope alone. It moves on proof. And proof, in this case, remained just out of reach. As the millennium approached, the world's attention shifted toward the future. Technology advanced rapidly. Digital systems expanded. New methods began to emerge. But for this case, the timing did not align. The evidence existed. The effort existed. The will existed. What did not yet exist was the means to connect them. By the early 2000s, the case transitioned quietly into a different phase. Not closed, not abandoned, preserved. Files were archived carefully. Physical evidence was stored under controlled conditions. Notes were maintained. The case remained accessible, waiting for the moment that something, anything, might change the equation. This is how many major investigations endure. They don't end with answers, they end with preparation. Prepared for a future moment when attention is no longer the driving force. Prepared for a time when technology might speak more clearly than memory. The 1990s gave the case visibility, urgency, and exhaustive effort. What it could not give was resolution. And so the case entered a long pause, not forgotten by those who worked it, not erased from records, simply waiting. Because attention doesn't guarantee answers. Sometimes answers require time to catch up. And sometimes the most important evidence needs decades before it can finally be heard. There's a moment in every long investigation when the noise begins to soften. It does not happen all at once. There is no announcement, no clear line between urgency and quiet. It happens gradually. By the late 1990s, the pace had changed. The phones no longer rang without pause. The stream of new tips slowed to a trickle. The same names began to reappear in review meetings, not because they were new, but because there were no others to replace them. Investigators reached a point they know well, even if they rarely speak about it publicly. The point where every reasonable lead has been followed, every address visited, every interview revisited, every assumption challenged, and still nothing moved. Witness memories, once vivid, began to soften at the edges. Time reshapes recollection in quiet ways. People grow less certain about dates. Sequences blur. What was once recalled with confidence becomes framed with phrases like "I think" or "it might have been." This is not failure. It is human nature. The world does not pause while investigations continue. People change jobs. They move away. They grow older. Some witnesses passed away. Others could no longer be located. A few simply no longer wished to revisit a painful chapter of their lives. By this stage, the case was no longer driven by momentum. It was sustained by discipline. Reviews became scheduled rather than reactive. Meetings were shorter. The focus shifted from discovery to preservation. Files were reorganized. Every document was checked, cataloged, and placed into structured order. Physical evidence was logged and stored according to evolving standards, not because it would be used immediately, but because it might be needed someday. This is how cases cool, not because they matter less, but because time imposes limits. Officially, the case was marked as inactive. Those words can be misunderstood. Inactive does not mean closed. It does not mean forgotten. It means waiting. Waiting without consuming daily resources. Waiting without promising answers that cannot yet be delivered. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning began to move on. Some were reassigned to new investigations. Others took on supervisory roles. A few retired altogether, carrying the memory of the case with them, even as the physical files remained behind. In police stations, corridors tell their own stories. Photographs are replaced, notice boards are updated, new faces fill familiar spaces. But in storage rooms and archive areas, time moves differently. Cardboard boxes line shelves, each one labeled, each one containing lives interrupted, questions unresolved, moments frozen in paper and ink. This case became one of those boxes. It was not special in appearance, no dramatic markings, no bold warnings, just a reference number, a date, and a location. And yet, for those who knew what it contained, it carried weight. Outside the station, the community adjusted. Life continued, as it always does. New businesses opened, old ones closed. Footpaths were walked again, gradually, cautiously. Fear faded into awareness, then into memory. People spoke about the case less often, not because it no longer mattered, but because there was nothing new to say. The media shifted its focus elsewhere. Headlines gave way to anniversaries. Anniversaries eventually gave way to silence. For many, this quiet was a form of healing. For others, it was simply the passage of time doing what it always does. But for the family, the silence sounded different. While the wider world moved forward, they remained anchored to an unanswered moment. For them, time did not soften the questions, it sharpened them. Each year that passed without resolution carried its own weight. Each milestone in life unfolded alongside the absence of clarity. They learned to live with uncertainty, but they never accepted it. This is the part of cold cases that is rarely visible. The moment when public concern fades, but private waiting continues. Investigators understood this, even as resources shifted. The case was reviewed periodically, often prompted by changes in technology or procedure. Each review followed the same careful pattern: reread the files, re-examine the evidence, ask whether something overlooked in the past might now appear different. Most of the time, the answer remained the same: not yet. And so the case settled into institutional memory, mentioned during training sessions, referenced in discussions about unresolved investigations, cited as an example of how complexity and circumstance can align against resolution. New officers learned its outline without knowing its details. It became part of the station's history rather than its daily work. Meanwhile, the physical world changed. Technology advanced quietly, steadily. Digital databases expanded. Analytical tools improved. Methods that once seemed experimental became routine. But none of this immediately altered the status of the case. Progress in science does not retroactively announce itself. It waits for opportunity. And opportunity in this case had not yet arrived. The box remained on the shelf. Inside it, evidence rested exactly as it had been preserved decades earlier. Not because anyone expected it to speak soon, but because someone, long ago, believed it might someday matter. That belief is the unseen thread connecting past and future investigations. Because even when a trail goes quiet, it does not disappear. It simply becomes still. Stillness is not the same as absence. In the rain-soaked streets near the woods, people continued to walk. Planes continued to rise overhead, indifferent to history. The paths became ordinary again. But under that ordinary surface, the record remained, waiting. Not for attention, not for headlines, but for the moment when time, technology, and resolve would finally align. And when that moment came, the quiet would end. Not with noise, but with clarity.
Time has a way of smoothing the edges of daily life. What once feels temporary becomes permanent through repetition. Streets become familiar. Faces become background. Movements repeat until they no longer register as noteworthy. Around Heathrow, life continued. The airport expanded, adapted, modernized. Terminals changed shape. Security procedures evolved. Traffic patterns shifted, then settled again. But one constant remained: movement. Vehicles flowed in and out every hour of every day. Among them were delivery vans. They followed predictable routes. They stopped briefly, then moved on. They blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the area. Drivers became part of the landscape. They were seen, but not noticed. Every morning, vans entered residential streets. Parcels were dropped off. Receipts were signed. A wave, a nod, a brief exchange of words, then the engine started again. This routine repeated itself day after day, week after week, year after year. And because it was routine, it invited no scrutiny. There is comfort in familiarity, Communities rely on it. Familiarity creates a sense of safety, of order. When something appears ordinary, it stops being questioned. That is how routine shields presence. A delivery driver driving the same roads does not raise alarms. Passing the same buildings does not draw attention. Stopping at the same junctions becomes invisible through repetition. Even the police station was simply another landmark along the route, a building passed without thought, a structure absorbed into the map of daily movement. For decades, this pattern held. The case, long archived, remained absent from daily conversation. New officers entered the station without personal memory of the original investigation. The events of 1994 belong to history, not immediacy. And yet, the man at the center of this chapter did not leave. He did not relocate far away. He did not vanish into another region. He did not cross borders. He stayed. He worked. He aged. He lived a life shaped by schedules and routes. From the outside, nothing distinguished him from thousands of others doing similar work. The roads around Heathrow are filled with people passing through, arriving, departing. In that environment, permanence hides in motion. This is the quiet paradox of busy places. The more movement there is, the harder it becomes to isolate one individual. Faces blur, vehicles overlap, presence becomes anonymous. CCTV cameras captured fragments of this movement over the years. Grainy footage from the 1990s gave way to sharper images in the decades that followed. Technology improved, but the sheer volume of data grew with it. A delivery van passing a junction in 1998 did not stand out. Neither did the same van passing in 2008 or 2018. Seen once, it is a moment. Seen thousands of times, it becomes scenery. This is not deception in the dramatic sense. It is camouflage through consistency. Familiar routes create trust. Familiar faces invite assumptions. People assume what they see every day is known, understood, and accounted for. That assumption is powerful. It shapes how communities perceive risk. It shapes how memory works. It shapes what is questioned and what is ignored. The man continued his work through changes in policing, changes in technology, changes in public awareness. New initiatives came and went. Cold case units were formed. Advances in science were discussed. Appeals were revisited briefly, then set aside again. None of it altered the rhythm of his days, because no one was looking in that direction anymore. Not out of negligence, not out of indifference, but because investigations follow evidence, not proximity. And at that time, evidence pointed nowhere. This is how plain sight functions in real life. It is not dramatic, it is not theatrical, it is quiet. It exists in habits, in schedules, in routines so stable they fade into the background. Neighbors see the same van and stop noticing it. Shopkeepers recognize the uniform without learning the name. Passing encounters leave no lasting impression. Over time, even memory adjusts. People forget when they first saw something familiar. They only know that it has always been there. That sense of permanence creates a blind spot, and blind spots do not announce themselves. The man aged alongside the area. Roads were resurfaced, signage was updated, new housing developments rose where old ones stood, but his route remained consistent enough to feel unchanged. Each passing year placed more distance between the present and 1994. For most people, that distance was emotional as well as temporal, but for the case, time was suspended. The box remained sealed. The evidence remained preserved. The unanswered questions remained unanswered. Nothing about the man's daily routine challenged that stillness. There were no sudden changes, no disruptions, no moments that demanded attention.
Invisibility through normalcy is one of the most overlooked aspects of long-term investigations. It does not rely on isolation, it relies on blending. The man was not hidden, he was present, and presence, when repeated often enough, becomes invisible. As decades passed, the idea that answers might be found nearby faded further from consideration. Attention shifted outward, to databases, to unknown individuals, to distant possibilities. Meanwhile, the familiar remained unexamined. This is not a failure of observation, it is a consequence of scale. In an environment as busy and complex as the Heathrow corridor, individual stories are easily absorbed into the flow of daily life. Traffic moves, people work, days pass. The past feels far away. But time does not erase proximity, it only masks it. And while the world changed around him, the man who never left continued along the same roads, past the same buildings, through the same intersections, including the one that housed the very institution that once searched for answers. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, simply as part of his route. For years, nothing disturbed this balance, until science began to shift the rules, quietly, methodically, without urgency or drama. The stillness that protected routine was about to encounter something it could not anticipate. Not suspicion, not chance, but memory preserved in a form that does not forget. And when that memory was finally given a voice, familiarity would no longer be enough to remain unseen.
Some cases endure not because of luck, but because of structure. They last because of how evidence is kept, because of how records are stored, because of systems designed to remember long after people move on. This is where the United Kingdom becomes essential to understanding why this story did not disappear. The UK waits differently, not with urgency, not with constant motion, but with preservation. From the outside, it can feel quiet, even still, but beneath that stillness is an architecture built for time. By the mid-1990s, Britain had already begun to change how it observed itself. Public spaces were increasingly recorded, not as spectacle, but as routine. Cameras appeared on street corners, outside shops, along transport routes. Early systems were basic, analog, grainy, often unreliable by today's standards, but they captured something invaluable: continuity. Even when images were unclear, they documented presence, movement, patterns. Heathrow and its surrounding areas became one of the most recorded environments in the country, not because of fear, but because of traffic. Airports demand oversight. Roads demand monitoring. Logistics demand coordination. Every delivery route passed through layers of observation, even if no one was actively watching at the time. Footage was stored, logged, archived. Most of it would never be reviewed again, but it existed. That matters, because waiting is not passive when evidence is preserved. As years passed, the UK continued expanding its approach to public recording. Systems improved, coverage increased, storage became more reliable. Old tapes were cataloged rather than discarded. Records were transferred rather than destroyed. This culture of retention created a foundation few fully appreciated at the time. Meanwhile, another system quietly reinforced this approach: evidence preservation. From the late 20th century onward, British policing placed increasing emphasis on retaining physical materials from unresolved cases, not because they expected immediate breakthroughs, but because history had taught them that science moves faster than cases do. Clothing, personal items, environmental samples. They were sealed, labeled, stored, sometimes revisited briefly, sometimes not at all, but they remained accessible. This is where many cases elsewhere fail.
evidence lost to time, records misplaced, materials destroyed under outdated policies. Here, the boxes stayed. They waited. And waiting in this context is not passive when evidence is preserved. As years passed, the UK continued expanding its approach to public recording. Systems improved, coverage increased, storage became more reliable. Old tapes were catalogued rather than discarded. Records were transferred rather than destroyed. This culture of retention created a foundation few fully appreciated at the time. Meanwhile, another system quietly reinforced this approach: evidence preservation. From the late 20th century onward, British policing placed increasing emphasis on retaining physical materials from unresolved cases, not because they expected immediate breakthroughs, but because history had taught them that science moves faster than cases do. Clothing, personal items, environmental samples. They were sealed, labeled, stored, sometimes revisited briefly, sometimes not at all. But they remained accessible. This is where many cases elsewhere fail. Evidence lost to time, records misplaced, materials destroyed under outdated policies. Here, the boxes stayed. They waited. And waiting in this context is not passive when evidence is preserved. As years passed, the UK continued expanding its approach to public recording. Systems improved, coverage increased, storage became more reliable. Old tapes were catalogued rather than discarded. Records were transferred rather than destroyed. This culture of retention created a foundation few fully appreciated at the time. Meanwhile, another system quietly reinforced this approach: evidence preservation. From the late 20th century onward, British police. For decades, this case waited, not because no one cared, but because the right question had not yet been asked. The question was not, who did this? It became, what can science now see that it could not before? By the early 2020s, forensic science had crossed a quiet threshold, not a dramatic leap, not a sudden revelation, but a steady accumulation of capability that allowed investigators to approach old evidence in a new way. This is where DNA phenotyping enters the story. To understand why this mattered, it is important to understand what phenotyping is and what it is not. Traditional DNA matching relies on comparison. A profile is taken from evidence and searched against existing databases. A match occurs only if that person or a close relative is already present in the system. Phenotyping works differently. It does not look for a name, it looks for traits. Using specific markers within DNA, scientists can estimate certain physical characteristics. These may include hair color, eye color, skin tone, and general facial structure tendencies. It does not generate a photograph. It does not recreate a face. It produces a probability-based image, a scientific approximation. This distinction matters. Phenotyping does not accuse, it does not identify, it does not replace investigation. What it does is narrow the field of possibility. It transforms an unknown person into a describable one. For cases like this, where no usable match existed for decades, that shift can reopen doors long closed. Investigators reviewing the Heathrow case faced a familiar problem. Evidence had been preserved, files were intact, the timeline was clear. What was missing was a direction. Thousands of interviews from the 1990s had produced volume, not resolution. Witness accounts overlapped, contradicted, faded. None could be tested definitively. DNA existed, but without a match, it remained silent. Phenotyping offered a way to ask something new of that DNA. Not who are you, but what can you tell us about the person you came from? The decision to pursue phenotyping was not automatic. It required review panels, ethical considerations, legal oversight. Phenotyping is powerful, but it must be used carefully. It cannot be allowed to bias investigations or lead to assumptions unsupported by evidence. This case met the threshold. The evidence quality was sufficient. The time elapsed justified advanced methods. The investigative avenues had been exhausted. Approval was given. The process began quietly. In a controlled laboratory environment, technicians extracted and prepared the genetic material. Each step was documented, each result reviewed. There were no guarantees. Many phenotyping attempts fail. DNA degrades, markers disappear, results can be incomplete. This time, the data held. From that data, analysts began assembling a composite, not a sketch, but a digital rendering based on statistical likelihoods. The image was built gradually. No dramatic reveal, no sudden face appearing on screen. Instead, layers, contours adjusted, features refined, variables tested. What emerged was not a person, but a guide, an image that said, "Look here." This was the turning point. For the first time in decades, the case gained a forward-facing element, not a theory, not a profile based on behavior, a scientifically grounded visual reference. When investigators reviewed the final rendering, they did not rush it to the public. They paused. They compared it to historical records, to past interviews, to individuals previously dismissed because nothing concrete connected them. One pattern began to stand out: delivery routes, not dramatic, not suspicious on their own, but persistent. Heathrow's surrounding areas rely heavily on logistics. In the 1990s, delivery drivers moved through these spaces constantly. They blended into the environment. Familiarity made them invisible. The image circulated internally among investigators first. Quiet comparisons were made. Old names resurfaced, not as suspects, but as points of reference. One resemblance was difficult to ignore. A man who had worked locally for decades, a delivery driver whose routes placed him repeatedly in the area, someone who had never left. The resemblance alone meant nothing. Phenotyping cannot identify a person, but it can prompt questions. Investigators reviewed records again, this time with the image in mind. Employment logs, route schedules, past addresses. Everything was cross-checked against the timeline. Nothing was rushed. Only when procedural standards were satisfied did the next step occur. The image was released publicly, not as an accusation, as an appeal. The language was careful, the presentation restrained. Authorities emphasized what phenotyping can and cannot do. They asked for information, not conclusions. The response was immediate but measured. People saw something familiar, a resemblance, a memory, not certainty, recognition. Tips came in. Among them were references to a local delivery driver who had worked the same routes for decades, a man known by routine, by consistency, by presence. This is where patience again mattered. Investigators did not act on resemblance alone. They initiated a voluntary DNA sweep within the neighborhood. This was done transparently, with clear legal guidelines and consent. The process was methodical. Residents were informed. Participation was documented. Samples were handled under strict protocols. The goal was not pressure, it was comparison. When the delivery driver agreed to provide a sample, it was treated like every other. No spectacle, no assumption, just procedure. The analysis took time. Weeks passed. Then confirmation arrived. The DNA profile matched. Not approximately, not partially, fully. This was not the product of chance. It was the result of decades of preservation meeting modern capability. Phenotyping did not solve the case alone. It reopened it. It gave direction where none existed. It transformed waiting into movement. Science did not replace investigation. It amplified it. This moment did not feel loud. It felt precise, a quiet alignment of evidence, technology, and time. The man had driven past the police station for years, not as a statement, as routine. That detail matters because it reveals something essential about cases like this. They are not always hidden far away. Sometimes they remain close enough to blend into daily life. Phenotyping did not uncover a stranger. It revealed familiarity. That's its power and its responsibility. Used correctly, it does not create stories. It clarifies possibilities. This case waited until that clarification became possible, and when it did, the waiting ended. Not because time ran out. When the image was released in 2025, it was done without ceremony. There was no dramatic press conference, no bold claims, no declaration of resolution. Just a carefully worded public appeal, accompanied by a single digital rendering. Authorities were precise in their language. They explained how the image was created. They explained its limitations. They emphasized that it was not a photograph, not an accusation, not a conclusion. It was a request for recognition. The image appeared on official channels first, police websites, verified social media accounts. News outlets followed, reproducing the image exactly as provided, without enhancement or commentary. The public response began quietly. At first, it was curiosity. People stopped scrolling. They looked twice. They read the caption. They absorbed the context. A case from 1994, unresolved for decades, now revisited with modern science. Then something shifted. Not panic, not outrage, recognition. It often happens this way, not in headlines, but in private moments. Someone pauses longer than expected. Someone feels a sense of familiarity they cannot immediately explain. Someone thinks of a route, a face, a presence that has always been there. Calls and messages began to arrive, measured, thoughtful, uncertain. I'm not sure if this helps, but this reminds me of someone. I've seen this person around the area for years. Investigators tracked patterns, not volume. They noticed how often one detail repeated. A delivery driver, not a recent one, not a passing face, someone who had worked the same area for decades. People described the same routines, the same streets, the same time frame. What stood out was not suspicion, but consistency. This individual was not someone who appeared briefly and disappeared. He was part of the landscape. Delivery drivers by nature blend into daily life. They are expected, recognized, but rarely examined. They move through neighborhoods without drawing attention. Familiarity creates trust. Routine creates invisibility. The resemblance between the image and this local driver was not described as exact. It was described as close enough to notice. Investigators approached the next steps with care. They did not publicize the name. They did not label anyone a suspect. They verified details quietly. Employment records confirmed that a delivery driver matching the description had worked routes in the Heathrow area since the early 1990s. Route logs placed him repeatedly near the relevant locations. None of this proved anything. It did something else. It made the question unavoidable. The detail that followed was one of the most quietly striking elements of the case. For years, decades, this man had driven past the local police station as part of his daily routine, not once, not occasionally, daily. The building that housed the very files connected to the case, the station where investigators had worked, retired, and passed the responsibility on, the place where the image now circulated. There was no suggestion that this was deliberate. It did not need to be. The fact alone carried weight, because it illustrated something central to this story. Time does not always separate people from their past actions. Sometimes it places them alongside it. Investigators continued methodically. They reviewed the full history of the delivery driver, not looking for confirmation, but for contradiction. Background checks, address histories, employment timelines. Everything was assessed against the known facts of the case. No shortcuts were taken. At this stage, the investigation relied on discipline more than urgency. The public continued to discuss the image, but authorities maintained restraint. They did not encourage speculation. They did not release additional details. They allowed the process to unfold. A voluntary DNA sweep was proposed in the neighborhood. This step was critical. It was conducted transparently, with clear communication. Residents were informed of their rights. Participation was optional. The goal was not to single anyone out. It was to compare, sample by sample. The delivery driver agreed to participate, again without spectacle. His sample was processed like all others. No special handling, no assumption of outcome. Weeks passed. During that time, the image remained public. It continued to circulate, not as a symbol of fear, but as a marker of possibility. People spoke about it in ordinary ways, at bus stops, in shops, online. There was no rush to judgment. That restraint mattered. When the forensic results returned, they did so without drama. The comparison was clear. The DNA matched, not approximately, not circumstantially, scientifically. This confirmation did not retroactively turn the image into proof. It validated the process that led to it. The image did not solve the case, it focused it. The resemblance noticed by the public was not the conclusion, it was the catalyst. Investigators moved forward according to procedure. The man who drove goods through the area for 30 years was now part of a formal investigation. The weight of that shift cannot be overstated. For decades, he had existed as a familiar presence, a driver, a routine, a passing figure. Now he was subject to the same scrutiny once applied to thousands of others. The fact that he had lived an ordinary life for so long did not complicate the process, it clarified it. This was not a story of disappearance, it was a story of proximity, of how everyday life can exist alongside unanswered questions, of how visibility does not always mean recognition. When the arrest would later occur, many would ask the same question: how could this go unnoticed for so long? The answer lies not in deception, but in structure. Modern cities rely on repetition. Routes repeat, schedules repeat, faces repeat. That repetition creates comfort. It also creates blind spots. The image disrupted that pattern. It asked people to look again, not with fear, not with accusation, with attention. This is why the image mattered, not because it shocked, but because it connected. It bridged decades. It linked preserved evidence to present-day awareness. It allowed the public to participate responsibly in resolution without replacing investigation, and it did so within clear boundaries. The man who drove past the police station every day was not revealed through spectacle. He was revealed through patience, through science, through process, through time finally aligning with capability. The image did not change the past, it changed the present. It transformed waiting into movement, and it demonstrated something essential about cases like this. Sometimes the key is not hidden far away. Sometimes it is part of the daily route, seen but not recognized, until recognition becomes possible. And when it does, it arrives clearly. That clarity marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of accountability. When the decision was made to conduct a DNA sweep, it was presented carefully, deliberately, without fanfare. This was not a dramatic raid, it was not a confrontation, it was a request made to the community, a request grounded in procedure, in law, in trust. The authorities explained clearly, participation was voluntary, no one would be compelled. No one would be presumed guilty. The goal was simple: to see if scientific comparison could provide answers that decades of investigation could not. Letters were sent, notices were posted, public announcements emphasized clarity, transparency, and respect. The community was asked to engage thoughtfully, to understand the purpose, and to cooperate responsibly. Slowly, people responded. Neighbors discussed it in low tones. Some hesitated, some volunteered immediately. Most did so quietly, aware that their actions contributed to something larger than themselves. Investigators set up procedures to handle the samples securely. Each kit was numbered, each sample logged, each participant informed. Chain of custody measures were reinforced to ensure that the process was as rigorous as the science itself. The sweep began in neighborhoods surrounding the area where the attack had occurred. Not an invasive search, but a structured, measured step forward. Every voluntary sample became a link in the chain of possibility. Among the many samples, one matched. It was not a random coincidence, it was not an assumption, it was a scientific comparison conducted under scrutiny, verified through repetition, and confirmed through proper legal channels. The DNA returned a definitive match, the same individual who had been recognized in the phenotyping image. For the first time in more than 30 years, investigators had a concrete connection between evidence from the 1994 incident and a living individual. It is important to understand the significance of this moment, not because it shocked, not because it was sensational, but because it was methodical, because it adhered strictly to procedure, because it transformed speculation into evidence without compromising fairness or respect for rights. Every step was deliberate, every procedure documented, every decision transparent. The public had been engaged responsibly, the community had participated, the science had delivered, the law had guided. The individual whose DNA matched the crime scene had not been publicly named at this stage. This was not an announcement of guilt. It was a confirmation of a lead that could now be pursued with care, with accuracy, with accountability. Investigators did not rush. They did not seize the moment for spectacle. They moved within the boundaries of due process, ensuring that the next steps would hold up under scrutiny and serve justice properly. For decades, the case had been defined by absence, missing information, unknown suspect, unanswered questions. Now, the absence began to resolve itself, slowly, precisely, reliably. It was a moment defined by restraint as much as revelation, by patience as much as discovery. The voluntary nature of the sweep reinforced trust between authorities and the public. People understood that the process respected them as participants, not as targets. And in that trust, the case found its turning point. The match confirmed what the phenotyping image had suggested, bridging decades of uncertainty. What had been speculation became scientifically validated. What had been anonymous became linked to an identifiable individual. Yet even in this clarity, the narrative remained measured. Investigators continued their work without dramatization. Arrest protocols, legal safeguards, and ethical considerations all guided each decision. The DNA sweep exemplified a careful balance between community cooperation and investigative rigor. The authorities did not exploit fear. They did not manipulate perception. They relied on science, procedure, and civic responsibility. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the discipline required. Imagine a case unresolved for more than 30 years, files in storage, leads long gone, witnesses with fading memories, generations of investigators who had retired or moved on. Yet, when the right technology met the right opportunity, the system allowed for resolution through cooperation, through transparency, through law. The match did not arrive as a headline. It arrived quietly. It arrived factually. It arrived according to process. And in that quiet precision, decades of waiting finally found a measure of closure. Investigators now had a confirmed lead. They had a living individual to question, to understand, and to hold accountable under the law. This was the moment when the weight of time met the rigor of procedure. The voluntary sweep had transformed uncertainty into direction. It had converted speculation into actionable investigation. It had reintroduced responsibility where decades of absence had allowed ambiguity to flourish. Importantly, this was a turning point defined by ethics and process. The police had not coerced. The public had not been manipulated. The evidence spoke for itself, verified through proper legal channels, ensuring that the next steps would uphold justice in both letter and spirit. In a case where the suspect had lived a routine life, driving past the very police station day after day for decades, this moment highlighted the intersection of visibility and recognition. Ordinary life, repeated for years, had concealed what science and civic cooperation now revealed. The voluntary sweep exemplified how modern policing can interact responsibly with communities even when addressing decades-old crimes. It illustrated that accountability is not about spectacle, it is about procedure, method, and respect for the rights of all involved. This stage of the investigation reinforced public confidence in the justice system. Citizens saw that cooperation mattered, that scientific methods could work without sensationalism, and that time, even decades-long delays, does not preclude eventual accountability. Through careful handling of the voluntary DNA sweep, investigators ensured that the resolution would be both legally sound and ethically grounded. Every sample, every comparison, every verification reinforced the legitimacy of the process. And for the first time since 1994, the case had a concrete foundation upon which justice could proceed. The community's role, willing, informed, cooperative, became part of the story itself. The sweep demonstrated that collective responsibility can bridge the gap between mystery and accountability, even when decades have passed. In the quiet aftermath of the confirmation, investigators took stock. The path forward was clear. The suspect was identified scientifically. The next steps would follow due process. The law would take its course. This was the critical juncture where patience met precision, where decades of unresolved questions finally had a starting point for resolution, where the system, designed to safeguard rights while seeking truth, had functioned exactly as intended. And in this moment, the narrative shifted. No longer a story of uncertainty, no longer a case defined by absence, no longer a puzzle waiting indefinitely. Instead, it became a story of methodical clarity, of procedural correctness, and of accountability emerging from decades of waiting. The voluntary DNA sweep was not traumatic. It did not need to be. Its significance lay in its accuracy, its ethics, and its ability to transform suspicion into actionable certainty. And in that transformation, the final path towards justice had begun. A path that would ultimately lead to formal charges, legal proceedings, and for the first time in more than 30 years, the possibility of closure for the victim and her family. This was accountability in its purest form, deliberate, transparent, and guided by law. It was proof that even after decades, process and science could converge to deliver answers responsibly. And it was the moment when the Heathrow Forest case finally began to see its resolution.